If you play a hidden minigame at the Carnival Garden, you're rewarded with a tea set. And if you sell it to the merchant in the same area, he'll give you some secretive information about a stolen theater prop. The missing item is the Puppet Prince's imperial crown, part of the costume of the Puppet Prince, a character famously played by the Red actress Adelina Corday. Even though the crown was stolen by opportunistic thieves, we're told that the sole survivor of this heist was transformed into a monster, eternally haunting the seas. At the Coastal Cave hideout, you get to witness the aftermath of this transformation for yourself.
The Puppet Prince dons the brilliant crown of the Imperium. Do you remember that glorious moment?
Upon a carcass monster's head is the Puppet Prince's crown, and he has quite a bit of dialogue illustrating just how much his sanity has unraveled. He stole the crown with his accomplices and fled from Krat by sea, hoping to sell it somewhere else and get rich quick. But in a cruel twist of fate, the very prop he hoped to rid himself of ended up becoming his sole obsession when he lost his mind. Killing him grants you the missing piece to the Puppet Prince set, and also ends his suffering. In the cutscene right before the fight with Arlecchino, you can see Romeo's suspended body in the background and what appears to be a crown upon his head. Taking a closer look, we see up close just how horrifying it actually is. An iron mask clamped over his face, covering everything except his eyes. The fingers of puppets are drilled into it, arranged like spires of a crown. His arms have been severed and replaced with a puppet's armature, and a literal crown of puppets placed upon his head. This is the gory foreshadowing that Romeo would indeed become the king of puppets. Romeo's mask mimics the appearance of the crown worn by his mech in the Opera House, a replica of the Puppet Prince's imperial crown. I have no doubt that Arlecchino fashioned this mask as a mockery of Romeo, and the way he's been suspended is very evocative of the crucifixion, complete with his very own crown of thorns. Leia cradling Romeo's injured body is imagery we've seen before, with the Saintess of Mercy statue, and again with Sophia holding Pinocchio. These poses are an art reference to the Pietà, the 15th century marble sculpture of Mary holding Jesus. Romeo's crucifixion was a display of Arlecchino's sadistic mockery, and his crown a foreshadowing of his heartbreaking fate. Our traitor's friend Lumacchio has a literary inspiration behind his name and design. He's a reference to the snail from Pinocchio, and her original name in Italian is Lumaca. Lumacchio is actually Italian for slug, even though we see his golden snail mask and his snail head once he transforms into a carcass monster, so he's much more a snail than a slug.
What? No. How could you? You promised you would let me live!
After you put the wretched traitor out of his misery, if you look down at his body, you can see tiny snails crawling around him. I actually missed this little detail the first 2 times I played the DLC, so it was a fun little catch when I noticed it the 3rd time around. We meet a series of broken mining puppets in the Ergo mines, and they're being used as a means of remote communication by former alchemist Alexander Goodman, who begs for our help in finding and rescuing him from his enclosure where he was trapped by his fellow alchemists.
I was on a date with the daughter of one of the most important alchemists. Apparently, he didn't approve, so there was a huge ruckus. Someone put a bag over my head, and when I came to, I was locked in this ridiculously dark place.
Alexander eventually guides us to his final location, and here he discovers that he's nothing more than a floating brain in a tube. Alexander suspects that his kidnapping and dismemberment was a result of him having a relationship with the daughter of an alchemist. While he was on a date with this woman, he was kidnapped and taken away to be killed, but they instead decided to use his body in the very contraption that Alexander himself invented, the Mind Keeper machine. It's very possible that Alexander was actually on a date with Sophia, as her father Valentinus was the head of the alchemists, and arguably the most important alchemist. Although Alexander suspects his kidnapping was a result of Valentinus' disapproval of him dating his daughter, I think the more likely scenario is that Simon orchestrated this. Simon had an unhealthy obsession with Sophia, and we learn from Sophia's diary that he had unsuccessfully tried to kidnap her previously. He also carries a lock of Sophie's hair in his staff, and while this might have had a practical effect in giving him access to her abilities, it was also a token of affection to carry around a loved one's lock of hair. In the end, Alexander ended up the same way he treated his victims he experimented on. It's an ironic case of justice being served. When we meet the blind painter Goddard at the zoo tram station, she asks for assistance in helping her place a blank canvas back on her easel. Although at first she just appears to be a helpless woman devoid of sight, we learn that she was once a high-ranking alchemist who was blinded after an incident. But she claims that this was a blessing as it allowed her to see the path of truth through art.
What do you see when you look at my painting? You have a good eye.
If you agree with her, you will have the chance to find her art supplies in the Salvador laboratory. Looking at her desk, we see some charcoal drawings, very artistically done, and it's clear that she was a very talented artist. However, if you take a look around Goddard's office, you see that it's right in plain view of the Salvador laboratory's experimentation floor. And now we know that Goddard was the artist behind all of the alchemist diagrams we see. Even though she might have been a wonderful artist, she was using her talents for nefarious purposes, illustrating anatomy pictures created from the dissection, dismemberment, and lobotomies of countless victims. Though Goddard seems to lack any remorse for her actions as an alchemist, she ensures her legacy as a painter will be remembered through her final work of art, and not her artistic contributions to the inhumane experiments she stood by and watched. When you reach Leia's temporary encampment after defeating the anguished guardian of the ruins, you find a couple audio recordings, one from Leia and the other from Arlecchino. As pointed out by a viewer in my last video, there is a very gruesome scene happening in the background of this recording.
And then you drove nine blades through me. All on your own. So, I have only you to thank, yes? I am grateful. Never in my life have I ever known such shameful disgrace. Yet, one can never be too careful. So, you must be assessed. Starting now.
What we're listening to is actually what took place at the Rose Estate, the horrific audio recording of Arlecchino dismembering Romeo's arms and stringing them up to the statue of Valentinus, completing his gory sculpture. At one point, we can even hear poor Romeo's labored breath and coughing, and as the recording progresses, we can hear him scream for a moment before he is silenced. It's a heartbreaking and traumatic recording, and it's even worse when you realize that you've already heard all of the details of Romeo's torture before you finally see it in the last chapter. In the cutscene where Leia finds Arlecchino's blood sculpture in the carnival garden, you might have noticed that the song in the background sounded a little familiar. The musical inspiration behind this song is Mozart's Lacrimosa from his Requiem Mass in D minor. You've most likely heard it before in shows and movies during a particularly sad moment. The lyrics to Lacrimosa happen to be exceptionally relevant for the scene we're witnessing. Full of tears shall be that day, when from the ashes shall arise the guilty man to be judged. In a cruel mockery to Leia, Arlecchino arranged the bodies of his victims into a giant, bloody rose. He truly made sure that he was living up to his moniker, the Blood Artist. When you first open the door to the Savannah Experience Center, you see the aftermath of a troubling scene.
There must have been a fight, but this much blood. Someone is dying or dead.
There's a broken blade surrounded by blood. The blade is adorned with particular markings, and it's a style that we've seen before. This curved blade is the very same one wielded by Romeo when you fight him during his second stage at the Opera House. When you find Romeo's severed arms, you pick up the last letter he wrote to Leia. He tells her not to be concerned that he's acting on his own, and that he wants her to get rest and get better. Romeo most likely went to the zoo to try and stop Marchionne's awful experiments, but he was ambushed, attacked, and kidnapped here by Arlecchino, who had recently just escaped the transport ship he was on in order to return to Krat and get his bloody revenge on Leia. Even though Gemini expresses hope at being able to save him, it was apparent very early on in this first stage that Romeo had sadly at this point in time already been defeated. Arlecchino's design in Overture is quite different from the version we saw in the base game. His long, upturned mustache and his proclaimed title as an artist might be a reference to the surrealist Spanish painter Salvador Dali. Dali is well known for his eccentric artwork and his equally as eccentric personal style, most notably his long, thin, waxed mustache. Dali's artwork has been known to cause some head turning in order to fully grasp his message, but thankfully he never had to kill anyone to make his sculptures. Arlecchino's surrealist sculptures, however, well, we know very well the art medium that he preferred to use. At the Alchemist shipwreck, you find a letter from beyond the sea. It thanks the Brotherhood of Truth for having sent golden medicine to treat their patients suffering from the stone disease. This communication comes from the land of the Radiant Dawn, also called the Country of the Morning, where Eugenie and Alidoro arrived from. Because of this letter, we now know that the petrification disease had indeed spread outside of Krat, or perhaps a more sinister origin, that Paracelsus was doing experiments with the arm of God in other countries, just like he had done to Krat. While we're told many times that the alchemists tried to make a cure, the only successful example we see was the golden medicine that Giangio makes in the base game for Lady Antonia. So it's unclear from this document as to whether at one point the alchemists had successfully developed a cure that Simon would later sabotage, or if this correspondence was meant for another brotherhood, perhaps the one that Paracelsus belonged to. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that in future content, I think there may be a chance that we'll get to see this mysterious Country of the Morning and what the stone disease might look like over there. The old fisherman you find outside of the shipwreck is a reference to Ernest Hemingway's last fictional story, The Old Man and the Sea. Salao, a name which comes from the novel meaning salt in Spanish and also a term for being incredibly unlucky, is based on Santiago. Santiago was an old fisherman who sailed out deep into the ocean and harpooned a giant marlin, probably around the same size as the catch we see behind Salao, but our Hemingway-inspired character has a much sadder fate than his literary counterpart. He tells you that after his wife Clara left him, he bought 3 bottles of brew, and he's been waiting to drink the last bottle in celebration of this monstrous catch. After he takes his last breath, you receive a key to his shack in the fishing village. Upon entering, you see on the bed the body of a carcass monster, and beside it, the last letter from the old fisherman to his wife. Due to the treachery of the corrupt lighthouse keeper, Clara, like the other residents of the fishing village, contracted the petrification disease. Unwilling to watch the woman he loved turn into a monster, Salao locked her in the cabin, said goodbye, and took his final voyage out to sea. Special thanks to Daryl from the comment section for having pointed out this awesome reference. The first enemies we see in Overture are the poor escaped zoo animals. They're all terribly deformed combinations of different creatures, caused by the side effects of the alchemist's elixir. The bear that we see has a horrific contraption on its head, very similar to the one we see in the Zelator laboratory. It appears that the alchemists under Marchionne's command were running the same experiments at the zoo that they had been running at the Zelator laboratory. They assassinated the zoo director, Colonel Little, and covered up his death as a reason to sweep in and take control, give them access to unlimited animal testing. These experiments ended up being a complete disaster and failure, and the alchemists ultimately decided to burn the zoo down in order to hide their insidious actions. In the Eventide version of Hotel Krat, we see Lady Antonia's portrait slightly draped in the hallway. There's nothing visually different about it in the past, but it wasn't until the DLC that I realized it's actually based on a very infamous portrait that got quite a few people upset during its original unveiling. Antonia's beloved painting is inspired by the portrait of Madame X. This portrait was done by the American painter John Singer Sargent, depicting the socialite Virginie Gautreau. The painter and his model received a lot of backlash for the portrait. Many people criticized it as being vulgar and too suggestive. Choosing this controversial portrait as the inspiration for Antonia's painting was a perfect choice from the art director, as I think Lady Antonia would have loved to be the center of attention and controversy over her great beauty. At the end of the game, when you obtain the key to Leia's room in the hotel garden, you see a portrait of her with Romeo and Carlo. Listening to the phonograph in her room, it's a recording of a song that we know very well by now, as it's the title song to Overture. Looking at the portrait and listening to the song is the final heartbreaking revelation of the tragedy of our trio. The song we hear in Leia's room was their last performance together. Leia on the violin, Romeo on the cello, and Carlo at the piano. We see a bottle of wine and an empty bottle of brandy on the ground, and it's clear that Leia was suffering greatly and numbing herself to lessen the guilt she carried over Carlo's death. So now every time you hear Overture's main theme, just picture that you're listening to Leia, Romeo, and Carlo during one of their last happy moments together. Piano recitals were used as a way to measure a puppet's precision and perfection, and this is why we see a puppet at the piano during the opening credits. We learned from Antonia's letter to Geppetto that she was training Carlo to be a pianist. When you first start the game, it's illustrated that Pinocchio really doesn't know what he's doing at the piano. He's able to play a couple notes, but it's not quite a tune. However, upon finishing the game, you can now sit down and perform a beautiful, complete song. It creates an interesting quandary. Do we now play the piano perfectly because we've passed the litmus test for advanced puppets? Or do we play beautifully because we have Carlo's ergo and his memories of being a pianist? This is one of the many reasons why I love this game so much. The fact that two statements can simultaneously be true, or one true and the other false, but it actually doesn't change the result. This is just some of the beautiful and thoughtful writing that makes me take a step back and appreciate the artistic intent. Thanks for watching my second installment in my Lies of P DLC series, and check out my first video if you missed it. I will be making an overall story explanation video, so look forward to that as well. I'll see you next time, my little puppets. Ciao, bello.